Hello, everyone. We are here today with another Collective for Climate Action event. It's the fourth one in our series of climate change and where we are. And today our topic is disruption, energy, transport and agriculture. And our speaker will be James Arbib, who will be talking to us about the speed and scale of technology-driven disruption and its implications across society. James Arbib is the co-founder of RethinkX, a non-profit think tank that models technological change differently to anyone else in the world, and their predictions are of massive disruption to all levels of society, including information, energy, materials, transport, food and agriculture. James has a history degree from Trinity College, Cambridge, and a master's in sustainability leadership, also from Cambridge. He's a qualified chartered accountant and has worked as an investment analyst, specializing in technology venture capital. He's also the founder of Tellus Mater, a grant-making foundation working on issues related to sustainability, and co-author of the book, Rethinking Humanity, 5 Foundational Sector Disruption, the Life Cycle of Civilizations, and the Coming Age of Freedom. A warm welcome to James Arbib. And without further ado, should we...
Very good. Well, thank you very much indeed, Sonia, and it's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background, and while I do that, I'm going to try and share my screen so I can begin to get a slide deck up that you can see. So just let me know that that's working, Sonia. Is that good?
Yes, it looks brilliant.
Brilliant. So as Sonia said, I've spent the last 15 years or so in clean tech venture capital, and I've also been involved in a number of climate change initiatives through a foundation that I set up 12, 13 years ago. More recently, I'm the co-founder of RethinkX, which is where I spend most of my time. And I came to found RethinkX 5 or 6 years ago now, after I met my co-founder, a guy called Tony Sieber, out in Washington, when we were both invited by the US military to contribute to a scenario planning exercise. And they were looking at a scenario of a rapid energy transition. They were asking the question, what will it mean for global geopolitics if we get off fossil fuels very quickly? And they had a bunch of experts in. They had 10 experts in from big organizations and big NGOs. Including big oil companies and consultants and departments of government and so on. And 8 of those 10 presentations were pretty much identical. They had predictions for the adoption of solar PV and the adoption of electric vehicles with these kind of linear forecasts out to 2040 or 2050. And even then, kind of very low levels of penetration. And I never forget Tony getting up towards the end and saying, look, that's not how technology disruptions work. They're not slow incremental progressions. They're rapid, non-linear S-curves. And these disruptions are over by the 2030s. And if you're making your plans for geopolitics on the back of these forecasts, you're going to make some horrible mistakes. Anyway, Tony and I spent some time afterwards, chatting, and for months afterwards, we talked on the phone. And really, we both had the same idea that mainstream forecasters across society totally failed to understand technology disruptions, and that we were going to see over the course of the 2020s the most extraordinary disruptions to pretty much every sector of the economy, and it was going to impact everything. It was going to impact our infrastructure planning. It was going to impact education and investment and pretty much every aspect of society, and yet we're woefully unprepared for it. And so we spent some time creating a framework, really based in complex systems, to better understand technology disruptions. Tony had been teaching technology disruption at Stanford for a decade before, so we had a good starting point. But and we've since published a number of reports on individual sectors of the economy. And last summer we wrote a book, Rethinking Humanity, which looks at the impact of these various disruptions across society on all kinds of issues. And I'm going to share some of that work with you today, but I'm going to start just briefly by talking about how change change happens, because this is really a talk about how we think about change. And when we look at any complex system, whether it's a climate or whether it's the human body or the economy, what we see are these long periods of incremental progress or even stasis, interspersed with these periods of very rapid disruption. And it's those periods of periods of rapid disruption where we get a fundamental change to the system. So it's not merely one or two variables changing; it's a fundamentally different system state with new rules, new relationships, and so on. And so change is not linear; it's non-linear, and it's really driven by the balance of these feedback loops, of the breaks that act to constrain change and keep us in an equilibrium state. And at certain points in time, they get overtaken by these accelerating forces, these accelerator positive feedback loops that drive very rapid change. And the new system that emerges is an entirely different one. And of course, this can cause cascading ripple effects across other parts of the system. That's all a bit theoretical. So I'm going to run you through an example quickly, and then we'll look at food, energy, and transportation very quickly, and have a think about what it might mean for society more generally. So I'm going to look quickly at the disruption of the horse, how the car replaced the horse sort of 100 years ago or so. And the first question I'll ask you is, how many gas stations were there in the US back in 1905? And the answer is 0. Not a single gas station in all of America. And yet, there were other sort of extraordinary barriers to the adoption of the car. It faced a lot of resistance early on. Of course, the early cars were hugely expensive and chronically unreliable. And consumers were very skeptical of these new vehicles. They loved their horses. And there was no oil industry, really. We produced a bit of kerosene, but certainly no refineries, no big oil finds by that point in time, very few paved roads, very little infrastructure, very little supply chain or manufacturing capacity, and so on. And of course, no one knew how to drive back then. So huge barriers to adoption. These are the constraining forces that acted against the adoption of the car. And yet, it took just 20 years for the car to replace the horse as a predominant form of transport, going from 2.5% of the market in 1905 to 95% of the market just 20 years later. So how on earth did that happen? Well, when we look at, I'm going to really walk you through very briefly our framework that we use to look at disruption. And it starts with the breaks that we talked about before. So there's enormous barriers often to disruption, both the lock-in of the previous system, but also the resistance to change that the prospect of disruption triggers. But at a certain point in time, certainly in technology disruptions, we see a convergence. And this is what happened in transportation. And that opens up a whole new possibility space for new products, new business model, new opportunities across society. So the car wouldn't have been possible without the invention of rubber vulcanization and the pneumatic tire and the Bessemer process that dropped the cost of steel production by 10x, and of course the combustion engine. And together these made a viable car possible. But it took time for them to become competitive. So they started off very expensive and they didn't work very well. But over time, the cost drops and capabilities improve. So in 20 years, we see the cost of a vehicle drop 10x or over 10x. And the capabilities improved. They became more reliable. They went faster. They had more power, became more reliable and more efficient and so on. So we see extraordinary improvements across multiple parameters. And that made them more competitive. And so gradually they began to displace horses. But of course, what really drives disruption are these accelerators. They're both a vicious cycle for the old industry and a virtuous cycle for the new. So the new industry sees increasing investment, it sees entrepreneurs and money and talent flood in. We see increasing government support. We see increasing economies of scale, which reduces costs and increases demand. And that's a virtuous cycle that drives this nonlinear shape of adoption. And the old industry goes into the reverse. We see reversing economies of scale, increasing costs, less demand, less government support, less investment. It's what we're seeing in the gasoline vehicle sector right now. Is investment floods from gasoline cars into electric and autonomous vehicles, and that drives a collapse of the old industry and the very quick adoption of the new. And of course, we see a totally different system emerge. And I just want to talk about that. We call this a phase change. It's a different system state. It's not just a simple substitution, a one-for-one substitution. A car is not a faster horse. It's a fundamentally different entity. And this is what most people fail to realize. So, we see a massively different, a massively bigger market opportunity open up. Cars obviously go faster, they carry more load, cover more distance. And so the market for cars was vastly bigger, as you can see in this graph, than the market for horses and carriages would be. And of course, you get a totally new value chain. We see new business models invented. Car finance was the start of the consumer finance industry. We see the moving production line invented to allow cars to be produced vastly more efficiently and more cheaply. And often in these disruptions, we see the sort of the deep knowledge of the existing system, going from being an advantage to being a disadvantage. There's an advantage to a clean sheet. And this is why we always see disruptors come from outside the industry, from the edge of the old industry, because they don't have that baggage of incumbent mindsets and interests and incentives that stop them taking advantage of the new technologies or even recognizing what the potential is. Just a very quick example here of a couple of patents from the early 1900s, which are kind of an indication of this one-for-one substitution that people were thinking about. We're essentially designing cars that look like horses. And that's a key problem that we have. We expect the future to be an extension of the past, but it's not. Everything changes. And we'll come back to that in a second. And of course, the effects of change ripple out across society. They can transform everything. So the car, of course, not only transformed the transportation industry, but it affected all other kinds of industries as well. So it affected food production, as we saw agriculture mechanized. We saw more fields come into production as we could get food to market quicker. Transformed the use of materials. Transformed retail as we moved to kind of out of town shopping and so on. But it also transformed how we built our towns and cities, where we lived, where we worked, where we sited our hospitals and schools and so on and so forth. And it had profound impacts across society economically. I mean, the car and the oil industry were what America's greatness were built on. By the 1950s, 1 in 7 jobs in the US was related to the car industry. Transformed geopolitics. See the 20th century becoming the century of oil. And of course, it had profound impacts on the environment. Good to start with, as we replaced carcasses and horse dung on our streets with something that appeared much cleaner. But obviously, the effects of fossil fuel use are now abundantly clear to all of us. So it can transform all aspects of society. The problem is we tend not to see how fast disruption can happen and how profoundly it can impact us. It's often the experts who are the least able to see what's coming. We make a number of mistakes. We tend to have a kind of reductionist mindset where we break down the complexity of the world into its individual parts. We see that reflected in departments of government or academic departments, and so on and so forth. So we tend to look at only one small part of the economy or one small part of society when we're analyzing change. But we also tend to extrapolate forward everything about today in terms of trends and data, but also the conditions in society. So, when we want to forecast the past, we tend to start by looking backwards to a point in the past and then drawing a straight line to today and extrapolating it forward. And of course, that's woefully inadequate. That's fine when you're in one of these long periods of incremental change. It's not a bad approximation for the future. But as you come up to a period of disruption, it's woefully inadequate. It leaves you completely blind to what's coming. And of course, this kind of siloed viewpoint that we have means that we fail to pick up the second and third order consequences of change, which can often be much more profound. And it makes us treat constants as variables. So we think everything that in our system today is going to continue out into the future. And of course it doesn't. And at different levels, those mistakes manifest in different ways. When we think about technology, it means that we fail to see the speed of improvement in the cost and capability of new technologies. When we think about a sector of the economy, we fail to pick up the speed of adoption or the change to the value chain and the structure of the industry. And in society more generally, we just ignore the kind of cascading impacts of change. It leaves us woefully unprepared for what's coming. So I'm now going to just run through our analysis of three sector disruptions, starting with transportation. And then I'm going to step back and look at how these might impact society more generally, particularly looking at climate change, but also some of the other social and environmental problems that we're facing. So first of all, transportation. When we look at transportation, we see two disruptions coming, two phases. The first is the one that's ongoing now, where EVs are replacing gasoline cars. And we see that happening quickly. We see that, if this was allowed to continue unchecked, we'd see by 2030, 100% of new car sales being EV. And that's really driven by these extraordinary improvements in the cost of electric vehicles. And of course, their improvements in their capabilities. But it's also driven by feedback loops. So we see the British government, for instance, introducing bans on the sale of EVs from 2035 and then pulling it forward to 2030. We expect those bans in some regions to come further forward themselves. It's what we're seeing also is a huge flood of investment in mainstream manufacturers moving from gasoline vehicles, which are going to cease to improve, which are going to stagnate. And we're seeing vast improvements in electric vehicles as investment floods in and economies of scale begin to grow. And as electric cars drop in price far quicker than most analysts expect. But the real disruption, the kind of systems level disruption, is when we get autonomy right, when we see transport as a service emerge. Essentially the concept of robo-taxis, which is a disruption to the whole model of car ownership. No one owns a car in that market, and it leads to a fundamental change, not just in the value chain, but in all kinds of different aspects. And that really comes down to vast improvements in cost. So an electric vehicle is obviously a far simpler entity than a gasoline vehicle. We've got about 18 moving parts instead of hundreds or thousands of moving parts. So there's less to go wrong. Obviously far less maintenance costs. But the real difference is in vehicle lifetime. We're seeing batteries already designed to last over 1 million miles. And there's nothing else in the car really that looks like failing within that time frame. So when you can get a 1 million mile plus car, it allows you to spread the upfront cost of the vehicle, the biggest cost of ownership, across 1 million miles in a high utilization model like robo-taxis or trucking. And so the cost per mile drops dramatically. And it drops so low that we think in certain instances we're going to see free transportation. That is in cities where we have very high utilization. In the same way, for instance, that Starbucks might give away free Wi-Fi because the cost of communications has dropped so low to tempt you in to have a coffee. We think all kinds of new business models will emerge that take advantage of that low cost, that low cost of transportation, and find different ways to monetize the user and allow transport to be provided for free. And that's transformational. Transform everything about the transport sector, but also how we design our cities and of course the environmental impacts. And that hugely low cost we think will lead to a very rapid disruption of the transportation sector, obviously with huge benefits across society, not just in terms of environmental, but in terms of health, in terms of accidents, in terms of all kinds of other things. And we'll see the value chain transform. So car manufacturing, for instance, will become commoditized. And the opportunities might exist both in the platforms, but also in these new opportunities that haven't existed, that have never existed before. For investors and for businesses, it's very important to recognize the scale of the disruption. This is not, an EV replacing a gasoline car. It's a totally different model of a totally different transportation system. And it will allow our cities to be redesigned in all kinds of ways, to introduce micro mobility much more, to transform how we think about transportation. Very quickly, the energy disruption. So we recently published a report. All our reports are available on our website, by the way, for free if you're interested in reading about any of them in any more detail. But energy, or electric power rather, is being disrupted by solar, wind and batteries. And it's obviously driven by extraordinary improvements in cost of solar, which has dropped 80% over the last decade. And we see a further 70% drop over the next decade. And also wind costs and battery costs, which have plummeted. So we're seeing solar, obviously, and wind as the lowest cost form of generation in most parts of the world, even today. And we're seeing a displacement of new build generation capacity, with solar and wind taking over from fossil fuels and providing the majority of new generation capacity globally. But But we're also seeing the cost of solar drop below the operating costs of gas or coal. And that's really interesting. Cost of solar and batteries together is still more expensive, but give it a decade or so and we'll see the cost of solar and batteries drop dramatically below the operating cost. And this really dictates how the disruption is going to happen. Just fast forward here. So the first stage of the disruption is the disruption of new generation capacity. But we're also seeing a disruption of peaking capacity as batteries outperform gas peaking in most parts of the world. And we're seeing a very rapid scale up of batteries to service that market. We're also seeing, we will also see shortly, and we're seeing in some parts of the world, the displacement of existing power generation. And that happens when solar, wind and batteries drop below the cost, the operating cost of existing generation. But the really interesting part comes when the cost of solar, wind and batteries drops below the transmission cost of a centralized system. We'll begin to see a decentralized system emerge. Totally different architecture, totally different dynamics. But what's really interesting about the energy disruption is how fundamentally different the architecture will be. So when you want to build a fully renewable grid, so let me just pass through these ones very quickly. When you want to build a fully renewable grid, you can do it in a number of ways. You can either build a system where you have huge storage capacity to get you through the darkest days of winter. And you get a very expensive system if you do that. At the other end of the scale, you can build a massive overcapacity of generation capacity. And again, that's hugely expensive. But in the middle, you get this U curve. And in the middle, you get the lowest cost system, which is also the lowest, by 2030, the lowest cost system we can build that's possible. And it's a balance between solar and wind. But it gives you a huge overcapacity of energy, essentially for free. And that leads to some really interesting dynamics. Let me just fast forward quickly. It gives you what we call superpower. So for every other day of the year, for all those times, not the darkest day of the year, you get an overcapacity of energy for free. And at the moment, we see that as a problem. It's a problem for renewables that we have to curtail, but actually it's a huge opportunity. We get this super abundance of energy that's available essentially for free. And so we think that other industries where demand is essentially shiftable will adapt themselves to take advantage of that. And we'll see, we think, steel production transformed, water desalination or transport electrification or the heating of homes and other buildings, or recycling or hydrogen production, or even kind of Bitcoin mining, or all kinds of opportunities. And this will transform industry after industry. And of course, the other side of the equation is that conventional power will become increasingly more expensive. And this, I think, has been missed by most mainstream analysts. We're already seeing the capacity factor of coal and now gas drop quite dramatically, the utilization rates of those types of energy, which means the cost per unit of power goes up. So when we build new gas or coal plants, we look at a levelized cost of energy, which takes a kind of total cost of running a plant over its lifetime and divides it by the amount of energy it uses. But for some reason, we treat the capacity factor, the utilization rate, as a constant. And it turns out it's not. It turns out that the capacity factors have been dropping over the course of the last decade. And so we've underestimated the cost of conventional power generation. We've essentially built a bunch of plants that we shouldn't have built had we properly accounted for this drop in capacity factor. And we see that dropping very fast. I mean, we've already seen in the UK, coal capacity factor, plunge, and we'll begin to see it for gas, we think. But elsewhere in the world, that dynamic's beginning to play out, and we think that'll lead to, well, essentially an extremely fast transition, so that by the early 2030s, we'll see a totally renewable system. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm going to run through food and agriculture very quickly, if that's okay. We can talk about it in question time if you're on. So again, precision biology is a key convergence of technologies here coming together to allow us to produce essentially any complex organic molecule that we choose to produce, without a plant or an animal being involved in the process. And it leads to just extraordinary new opportunities across all parts of all parts of the economy. And one of the key technologies is precision fermentation. It's where we add precision biology to the age-old process of fermentation. We essentially hack microbes to produce for us, whatever molecule we want. It's a technology that we first used to produce insulin. So back in the early 1980s, we used to produce insulin from the pancreas of a pig or a cow, and it took 50,000 animals to produce a kilo of it. We worked out how to hack microbes essentially to ferment human insulin. So obviously a better product, better tolerated, better performing, but also eventually vastly cheaper. And over time, the costs come down from $1 billion per kilo in the early 1980s to $1 million by 2000. And today it's well below $100 per kilo. And we've seen it begin to be used in other markets beyond just healthcare. It's been used in cosmetics, and we're beginning to see it being used in the food market. It's what Impossible Burgers, for instance, use to produce their burgers. And over time, costs will come down. We think, by the mid 2020s to cost parity with bulk proteins from animals, and by 2030 and 2035 to a fraction of the cost. And so not only are these ways of producing food and materials going to be vastly cheaper than we can produce from animals or plants, but also better in every parameter, far more adaptable, far better for the environment, far better for human health, and so on and so forth. So better in kind of every parameter. We've never had a system before where we've had lower cost, more secure, more resilient food supplies as an alternative to plants and animals. And we think government regulatory support will move over time as we see this disruption evolve to support that and drive those feedback loops even faster. I'm just going to run through these slides very quickly. So this is a disruption that really turns on its head the model of production. So today, what we tend to do is we grow the whole plant or animal and we break it down into the things we need. So the most expensive and the most difficult thing to get to are the kind of single molecules, which have to go through all kinds of processing stages. The cheapest and easiest to get to in terms of processing costs is obviously the meat. You just carve it off the carcass. The new model is the other way around. You start with a single molecule and you build up into more complex products. The hardest and the last to be disrupted, we think, will be the steaks. But as we disrupt, whey protein and collagen and insulin and so on, and all these other things that the cow or livestock currently go into, we'll eventually see, animals produced just for the meat. And so we'll see a vicious cycle that drives up the cost of meat production, as the meat has to bear the whole cost of producing the animal. And of course, some of the things that are currently an asset, like the hide that we sell for leather, might become a liability as we have to pay to dispose of it. So by the 2030s, we might see the cost of meat spiral upwards dramatically as the cost of novel proteins begins to drop dramatically. And we just don't think animals can compete with these new technologies. And the disruption will be extremely rapid. And of course, disrupting livestock farming has huge implications across society, not just environmentally, but on land use as well. The extraordinary amount of land we use, both as pasture land, but also to produce food for animals, be freed up for other uses, including deforesting, reforesting, or rewilding, and so on. So having an impact potentially on our emissions trajectories. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Let me just fast forward through these slides, and we'll get to the next piece, which is really in some ways the most important piece to understand, and it's what I refer to as the cross-sector disruptions. Because so far we've looked at sectors of the economy in isolation, and of course they all interact; they're all interconnected, and disruption to one causes disruption elsewhere. So transportation, for instance, whilst there's an extraordinary disruption going on in terms of the technologies we're going to use and the transformation to the market and the transport system, actually a bigger disruption might come from outside the sector. It might come from a disruption to our need for transport. So we're seeing, already during the pandemic, the information and communications technology disrupting our need to travel for work or for shopping or for education or for entertainment and so on. And we think that'll continue as communications technologies get better and better. But also, we're seeing a huge disruption to our whole model of production. You know, these new technologies lead to a far more distributed, localized production system. So as we disrupt energy, we won't need to ship the huge quantities of coal and oil and so on through the economy. We'll also not be shipping the the livestock products and other agricultural produce. We won't be shipping the huge numbers of cars and car parts. All these things are major impacts on shipping and trucking and trains and so on and so forth. And as we see production localized and essentially abundant locally available resources powering our economy, the need for transportation, we think, will be disrupted. These huge flows of physical goods that we see through our system today, replaced basically by vast flows of information. So transformation in our whole model of production. Just gonna fast forward. So when we think about greenhouse gas emissions, we see by the mid 2030s a transformation of our transport system with a hugely reduced emissions profile. Same for electric power, and of course, electric power, as we talked about earlier, will disrupt other sectors of the economy. So we see steel production, for instance, powered by renewables, as we get this super abundance of free energy, and other forms of energy use disrupted as well. Agriculture will have a profound disruption, we think, and of course, superpower will disrupt the use of energy in industry and buildings to a certain degree. And this ability to use land in different ways, we think, just leaving it alone actually will allow carbon to be sequestered. We ran the numbers in the US, and 5% of the land that we see being freed up by 2035, sorry, 10% of the land we see being freed up by 2035 could offset all emissions from agriculture. And if you to rewild or reforest all of it, we might see all emissions today offset. Now, of course, we think that emissions by 2035 will be far lower. So there is a real possibility to get down to zero emissions or below by the mid 2030s, and we must take account of how fast these disruptions are moving, and the potential to transform all kinds of outcomes. I just very briefly want to talk about the kind of systems level disruption, because what we're seeing is actually a transformation of our production system. So we're moving from what we call an extraction based model of production, which is really the system of production that's been around for the entirety of human civilizations. Over time we've learned to extract scarce resources and exploit scarce resources at ever bigger scale. We can now do it globally. And it leads to these kind of centralized, high cost, high waste production systems. The new model is entirely different, a different architecture, a different nature. It's a build-up model. It's a generative model of creation. It's based on abundant resources, the wind, the sun, the molecules and cells that are available in abundance everywhere. We think will lead to localized, self-sufficiently and entirely decentralized system of production, essentially globally connected by an information network, or the model we call the network and the node. Entirely different system. And it transforms everything, because those tensions we see in our current system, the trade-offs that we have between economic outcomes and environmental outcomes or social outcomes, just don't exist. It's like cutting the Gordian knot. No longer the exploitation of people or planet hardwired into our system of production. In the current model, we have to compete globally, and so we can't slow down. We can't. This is a dynamic that's driven previous civilizations to expand beyond their limits and then crash, because those civilizations that have tried to slow down and live more sustainably have always been overtaken by those who haven't. The dynamic in this new creation-based model is entirely different. And we think it will require entirely different governance structures, entirely different models of thought, entirely different ways of understanding, managing, and governing the system. And so when we think about our problems today, there are all kinds of problems. And what we're tending to do is to look at our existing system and work out how we can patch it up. So most of our solutions to climate change or inequality or poverty, we think are kind of sticking plaster, band-aid solutions, patching up that old system. We don't realize the speed at which this new system, the profound difference that this new system represents and how quickly it's going to arrive. We spend very little time on enabling this new system of production. We spend far more on these sticking plaster solutions to the old system. Just going to fast forward these. So, you know, when we think about climate change, for instance, you know, we look at kind of techno fixes like carbon capture and storage, or clean diesel, or all kinds of kind of agricultural interventions, which try and patch up the old industrialized system of agriculture, rather than enabling this entirely new system. And by 2040 or so, you know, most of the economy, or all of the economy, will be based on this new creation-based system of production. So that old system we spend so much time and effort patching up just won't exist. And you know, there are a number of fallacies that we have because we fail to understand how quickly change might happen, including that it's going to be expensive. I mean, all of these disruptions at their heart are being driven by economics. They're being driven by new technologies that are better and cheaper than the old. And that's a huge, powerful driver of change. It means that economics will drive these, the market forces will drive these disruptions. And the role for government and society is to enable them, to recognize them, to embrace them, and to remove any of the barriers. So really, you know, the problem we think we face as a civilization is one of thinking that we're coming into a decade of extraordinary opportunity, but also catastrophic risk. We have the potential to break through to this new system. We also have the potential to crash if we get it wrong. But the problem we face is we don't see the scale of possibilities emerging. We see the kind of continuation of our current system ad infinitum into the future. And that's dangerous because we invest all our time and resources in patching that system up, in trying to prop it up as long as it will last. We can't solve climate change. We can't solve any of our problems through that old system. We can buy ourselves a few more years for sure through behavior change, by giving up consumption or so. But it's ludicrous to pretend that we can solve climate change through, for instance, through behavior change. But we need to get to zero. We need to get below zero, so that, you know, the social costs and human suffering of giving up consumption to that level, it's just impossible. It just can't happen. It's economically impossible. And also by doing that, you know, we'll destroy the economy to such an extent that the capital to build this new system will disappear. So it's economically illogical to go down that road. But the good news is we have most of what we need to go down that pathway to decarbonize the economy, and we'll make money doing it. But we need to see that this potential exists, and we need to understand some of the other societal impacts of this new system. Essentially, we need to learn how to rethink and unlearn our old ways of thinking. I'm going to leave it there and open up for questions. And I hope I didn't go on too long. God, I did. I'm sorry, Ian and Sonia.
Oh, it's all good. Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
So I get a little carried away.
Not at all. Yeah, I think everybody enjoyed that. And we do have questions as well, so it's good. We still have time for those as well. So let's get cracking, because there are quite a lot. New ones are being posted to Slido all the time. So first we have a question from Matt, who says, my understanding is that lithium-ion batteries are built with finite materials. Is there a move to go beyond this model of transport, for example, towards hydrogen?
Yeah, so I mean, hydrogen is more expensive right now, and you know, I don't think offers a solution apart from kind of, you know, niche markets within the transport sector and perhaps the energy sector as well. What you have to remember with new model of transportation, if we build, you know, if this disruption is about you know, EVs replacing gasoline vehicles, then yes, we've got a problem, because we'll have to build, you know, hundreds of millions of electric vehicles. But when we move to a model of robo-taxis, you need far less vehicles. You know, you need a tenth of the vehicles in the vehicle fleet. They can each, you know, each vehicle is in operation all of the time, and we use our current vehicles about, you know, 4 or 5% of the time. We'll have these vehicles running around all the time. So, you know, you need far less, you know, far less batteries. Yes, they're based on scarce materials, and yes, we'll need to build them out. So we see during the 2020s, a huge scale up in requirements for a lot of these materials. But once we've built the transport infrastructure, the food infrastructure, the materials infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, then actually, the requirements for these things will be far less. We're already learning, for instance, how to recycle batteries to harness those scarce, rare metals and other parts of the battery. But we can also change chemistries. I mean, battery chemistries are flexible. They represent trade-offs between different properties, performance or energy density and so on and so forth, or cycles and so on. So we don't see any real resource shortages, certainly not when we go to this kind of, fleet model. I mean, certainly there'll be scale up issues during the course of the 2020s, but those will ease as we get to the point we've kind of built out the infrastructure and we can move much more into a kind of circular recycling model, which will, will naturally emerge. It won't need to be regulated. It will be what the market delivers.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Ian, which is, have you seen any patterns of potential massive growth in different carbon capture markets?
Carbon capture markets? Are we talking kind of CCS and so on? Or
I would imagine, yes.
So I can dip in on that one. Just thinking about like the biochar industry, for example, there's like a big issue at the moment with the fossil fuel industry trying to use its infrastructure to sequester compressed or like a CO2 gas. And just thinking that there's obviously an alternative, which is a solid, stable form of carbon that we could use. And I was just wondering if you're noticing any changes in that part of the carbon capture space.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a part we looked at. So our analysis shows us that, over the next 10 to 15 years, we'll see a major disruption to pretty much every sector of the economy, which will largely lead to a decarbonization. There are small parts of the economy we won't be able to decarbonize through these kind of market-based forces, but they're far smaller than most mainstream analysts think. So most of carbon capture and storage we think is an unnecessary cost. We will need to address the other half of the problem. Of course, climate change is a problem not just of the flow. It's not just turning off the tap of carbon emissions. It's also a stock problem. We need to empty the bath. And actually just getting to zero is not good enough. I mean, the odds, 450 parts per million of triggering runaway climate change, something like 25%. So, that's somewhat terrifying. So I think we need to learn how to sequester carbon. There are all kinds of ways of doing that. I mean, maybe biochar is one of them, but, we've looked at a number of others. I mean, we think that superpower, for instance, essentially free energy and a superabundance of free energy transforms the cost of essentially geoengineering, all kinds of different different ways we could do it. We've been looking, for instance, enhanced weathering of rocks as a way to do that. Now that today requires huge energy input. So they're kind of, you're shooting yourself in the foot using today's system. But by the 2030s, we'll have this superabundance of energy, and it'll be clean energy. So we can use it to essentially geoengineer to some degree. So we think that's going to be that whole marketplace is going to be transformed. Now, I can't tell you what the winning technology or suite of technology is going to be, but I would be confident, given these trajectories, that we will find ways, and that the cost curve of geoengineering will come down dramatically, and actually, we'll be able to, address the stock problem, and turn our focus, merely from the flow problem, which is clearly just half of the issue.
Thank you. And you, of course, mentioned also rewilding as a possibility for capturing some of that carbon.
Yeah, so we'll have an abundance of land, right? We'll move agriculture, or large parts of agriculture, out of the field, and we'll have an abundance of land that we'll be able to use for other purposes. It'll be a social choice as to what we do, and we should probably be beginning to discuss that with all the interested parties, because if we don't kind of have a plan for it, it'll be an unconstrained and uncontrolled land grab essentially, and we'll end up with suboptimal outcomes. But but yeah, that abundance of land, I think, is you know, just doing nothing, the do nothing option. And again, for the oceans, right? I mean, you know, we'll be producing fish in this way as well. So, you know, if you've got a lower cost, healthier, you know, kind of better performing on every parameter alternative, it makes it far easier to impose regulations to stop the old polluting, dangerous. So, you know, it becomes far more possible, for instance, to have a global ban on fishing. Now, if we just did nothing and allowed the oceans to recover and allowed the land to recover, that'd be a huge carbon sink, at least for a few decades. But we could accelerate that. And there'd be no cost to that, of course. But then, you know, we could actively rewild or actively reforest. There's no real business model today for that, but we might choose to invest some of the farming subsidies, essentially, that we're saving in that kind of model, and we could accelerate the, you know, the carbon sequestration of both the land and the ocean. So, you know, we'll have choices that we just don't have today, and it's, you know, I mean, I guess our work is about trying to highlight possibilities that maybe we're not seeing, that are coming down the path.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. We have next question from Louise Maris Evans, and she is asking, if you were writing the government's net zero strategy, what would you ensure you put in it? How do we enable the transformation locally?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So we've been asked by a couple of governments to sort of write them an action plan. And we always say, well, you know, we can't give you a kind of, you know, 10-year action plan. This is a kind of emergent process, and we can give you a kind of series of principles. And so I think, you know, item number one on any list like this is actually about kind of mindset and about thinking. I mean, it's about, you know, understanding the economy or society through a complex systems lens, understanding interconnections between the pieces, and understanding, you know, the potential speed, scale, and impact of disruptions we're about to see, and the interconnection between them. And I think that's, you know, that's a really important starting point, because unless you can see the possibilities, and we can't predict the future, but what we can do is see the, you know, the range of possibilities that are emerging, and that has to be the starting point. The second point is to kind of, you know, remove the subsidies and the support for the old industries. You know, people generally think of kind of, you know, the old fossil fuel industries, oil and you know, utilities and so on, as sort of these big, powerful forces that are going to resist any kind of change. I mean, they're actually kind of, you know, paper tigers. They're very fragile. You know, we'd expect them to, you know, over the course of the next decade, you know, be disrupted. I mean, you know, they don't transform themselves to go bankrupt, because it's an industry where, you know, change is going to happen very fast. And, you know, we actually think, and certainly in terms of utility, there's going to be a period of time in the 2020s where we actually have to subsidize fossil fuel power plants to keep the lights on, right? Because then they make no economic sense. Their utilization rate will be so low, but we'll have to keep using them, and we'll have a period of time where we actually have to subsidize them. So, you know, I mean, I think it's to you know, the first thing is to kind of give clarity. I mean, I think, you know, things like the ban that we have on gasoline vehicles from 2030, you know, a good starting point. They give some kind of certainty to investors and to businesses in terms of their planning, and begin to drive change. You know, I'd be more aggressive. I remember my partner Tony being interviewed when the UK announced, or I don't know, it was the UK, it was one of the governments announced a ban on gasoline vehicles in 2035, and they asked him for a comment, and he said, well, you know, it's a bit like banning horses. You know, that we just won't be driving cars by 2035, or gasoline cars. So, you know, we can be more aggressive with some of these targets to give some certainty to investors and to drive the flows of capital. And of course, you know, keep the playing field as level as possible. In some ways, get out the way. But it's also about not doing the stupid stuff, right? I mean, you know, allowing, you know, the best solutions to emerge. So, you know, we're seeing a lot of investment, for instance, in hydrogen right now in Europe and other parts of the world. And that's potentially dangerous, right? It might be a solution we don't need. We think hydrogen will find niches, but I don't think it's a kind of widespread solution to, you know, to many of the transportation and energy problems that perhaps we think. I mean, it's a very centralized, it's a very centralized, infrastructure, and it's not dissimilar to a kind of a gas infrastructure that we have today. So I think we've got to be careful about making investments that we might not need. I mean, things like high speed 2, for instance. I mean, it in our world is a kind of crazy investment. I mean, I remember speaking to I think it's a rail delivery body or whatever at one point in time, and suggesting they did the sums on repurposing a couple of lanes of highway up north, because we won't need by 2030 all the road space that we're currently using. Trucks will largely kind of disappear, and we already have the technology essentially to run road trains, autonomous electric vehicles up and down. You wouldn't need stations. The vehicles could kind of the various pieces of the train could kind of peel off and go into city centers, for instance. I have no idea. We haven't done the sums, but I imagine it'd be vastly cheaper than building a whole new rail infrastructure, which is obviously a completely inflexible way of traveling. So I think it's generally just about keeping eyes open. I mean, that's my first principle: understanding the possibilities, removing the subsidies and support for the existing industry, and don't do anything stupid, right? I mean, don't be very careful if you're trying to pick winners yourselves, because largely these disruptions will be delivered by market forces. I think there's also the market design piece, which is the final piece. The food and materials disruption, it could end up looking like the pharmaceutical industry if we get the wrong kind of IP regimes and so on and so forth, where they actually end up being, I mean, the development costs are very low, so we don't need the same kind of IP regime they have in pharmaceuticals to encourage drug development. But it's not to say we won't end up there. And the very low cost of production might not get passed on to the consumer. So that's a concern. And so I mean, those would be my kind of high level recommendations.
Thank you. Great. We have so many questions. I don't think we're going to be able to ask them all. Let's try to squeeze in a couple more. There's one from Rich. He first has a comment saying that is an optimistic assessment about the speed of change required. And then he has a question about how can we ensure that it is a just transition and works at a global scale. And I think this is especially interesting in terms of the rare earth minerals that are needed, for example, for renewables, which we know that are causing a lot of problems for indigenous lands and land grabs in certain countries. Yeah.
No, I mean, that's the most common comment we hear, that we have an optimistic view on the pace of change. And I understand where that comes from, and I fully accept that. I actually I think what's happening in reality is we tend to be somewhat too conservative, certainly in our predictions for the cost of energy and the cost of electric vehicles. They've actually outpaced. We're always the most aggressive estimate in the market, and actually the real world's kind of outpaced us. And that's a factor of these kind of systems dynamics that we see that are driving this kind of pace of change. So yeah, I mean, we won't know the answer for a decade or so. So I'll, well, I guess we'll have to wait and see. But typically disruption happens far quicker than people anticipate. And we've studied an awful lot of disruptions. We've studied an awful lot of predictions, and it's it's always surprised us, not just in speed but in scale and in terms of a just transition. I mean, that's it's a big issue. I mean, there are some interesting dynamics about this disruption that mean that I mean, we write in our book Rethinking Humanity about disruption always coming from the edge, and that's not just technology disruptions at a sector level. It's in terms of civilizations and societies. But actually, it's going to be very hard for us in the West to make the kind of scale of adaptations necessary to manage this sort of distributed networked economy or production system that emerges. So actually, there are parts of the developing world they might find it far easier to make the adaptations, and sort of not just at a production system level, not just in terms of building a new energy or food or transportation system. We will see kind of leapfrog technology, or already happening in some of those markets, but actually in terms of their mindsets, their ability to embrace the scale of change. So it's quite possible that the leaders of the new era come from those places, but also actually a lot of those parts of the world that are kind of behind today have an advantage as we go into this era. So the UK and Northern Europe, right, who were kind of leaders, I guess, of the industrial age, actually going to face higher cost energy costs, because we have less favorable solar and wind. I mean, solar is going to be the lowest cost form of power compared to wind. We're more wind reliant, but Northern Europe will have a higher cost energy system because we have this dynamic of these dark winters. We have to build a much bigger overcapacity to get through it. So, someone like India, which we have modeled, has a vastly lower cost energy system, which obviously feeds into every other sector of the economy. And so, some of the competitive dynamics we've seen in the old world, change in the new world. I think ultimately, though, it's about getting our governance structures right. I mean, our current system. I mean, what we term an extraction-based production system. Exploitation of people is kind of hardwired into it, right? And every society, every successful society, every society that's kind of come to dominate its era has had that at its center. I mean, it's been a kind of necessary evil in some ways. What we're seeing now is a completely different system where that dynamic doesn't exist, where you don't have to exploit to compete. We've just got abundant locally available resources. And as increasing automation comes through, labor will be less of an input into the production system. And so, there is the potential for a far more equal division of resources without affecting kind of, progress and competitiveness. But whether that happens, depends on the choices we make. I mean, it's not a prerequisite. And I think, when you move into a much more of an information-based economy, which we'll see across all those sectors, the network effects that drive those economies are actually far more powerful than the kind of economies of scale that we've seen in the industrial age. And so, they drive a single winner rather than multiple big winners. And I think we could see a far more unequal society if we don't do something about those sorts of ownership models and find new ways to, think about to think about that. So, it really comes down to choices. It's not, there is a potential and certainly a possibility for a far more equal outcome, but it's by no means guaranteed.
One really quick question, James, with regards to the feedstocks for protein, cultured proteins, are they going to have similar? Are they going to have more resilience than we currently have with our, current forms of mass food production? Well, where does that come from?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a carbohydrate stock. So sugar generally used, and it's basically sugar water now, which is a kind of the input. Along with the microbes. So the microbes are really information, right? We share the information, the kind of genetic information for the microbes. So what powers those production processes is really sugar water, and currently it's sugar. But ultimately it could be any carbohydrate source. It could be leaves or tree bark or all kinds of different things. So they are hugely abundant compared to today's system. I mean we'd need far lower quantities to power those systems. They're just more efficient processes. Vastly more efficient to grow proteins through these novel methods than it is to grow them through animals. Essentially, I mean you're essentially taking the process that's going on in the cow's stomach and putting it in a bioreactor. I mean, it's not different, but you're also then able to kind of produce all kinds of other things as well.
There was one thing for me, like living where I live, there's a few livestock farms around here, and just looking at the amount of land that is left, in just in regeneration, waiting for, to have enough grass on it again for cows to actually graze on. It's just astonishing the amount of land that's actually needed. And it just got my imagination growing. It's like, again, there's a huge wetland area that has all been drained near Bristol where I live. And all of that would just have a tremendous amount of biodiversity in it. But instead, there's a few streams that have some seagulls living in them, a bunch of insects, and not much more. And just seeing how rich some of the sunset levels are, where they have just let it go back to nature, it just really got my mind going along that space and thinking about how much more resilient nature could be if it has all that biodiversity living in it, instead of the degraded state that it currently exists in most of our countryside.
Yeah, and I think that's, it becomes possible when we move into a new form of agriculture in a way that it doesn't, if we stick to, we might patch up the current system and make it a little better with better irrigation and better fertilizer, and it's not a solution, right? It's still an unsustainable system. And I think you're right, and all kinds of other problems come from this as well. I mean, we deforest the Amazon essentially to feed cows. I mean, it's those problems go away. We can now produce, for instance, palm oil through precision fermentation. Right, so you've got the potential to transform all these other kind of issues, which really at their root, I mean, most of the world's problems come back to these foundational sectors of the economy and the way we currently produce, food, energy, and materials, like matter, energy, and information. That's where all these things stem from. And when we transform that model, all those problems, transform as well in terms of how we must think about them and what the impact of our production system is on them. In a really profound way, and I think that's a challenge. And it's these patching up solutions. They might sound great, but they're the current model of producing food is not. We could never have an equal world, right? Even if everyone equalizes out at half the American level, we're way beyond what the food system can produce. And so, we need to find this new system. And the good news is that it's coming, and it's going to be vastly cheaper. And obviously far less impactful as well.
Those are great words to finish with, because I think we've gone slightly over time. This has been a really interesting talk. Thank you, Jamie. And just before we completely wrap up, is there a chance that we could share the slides with the participants? Because that was a question that was being asked.
Sure. Can I just put them in a PDF format and send them back to you? Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you very much.
Well, just to say as well, we'll carry on the conversation on Slack. I'll be posting some links to the Green Lines podcast that you're in, which was really interesting, and that was all about sustainable, the transition away from normal agriculture and the disruption to that. That was really, really interesting. And also, there's obviously your reports that are still available for nothing on your site, and there's some great articles on there about the one about the amino acid that's going to be cultured or is being cultured instead of sugars, so that we can have loads of sweet treats and not worry about getting diabetes. I strongly advise everyone to have a look at that, and I'll stick some more links on Slack about all the content that you guys have provided.
Very good. Well, thanks everyone, and I really appreciate you inviting me on.
Yeah, thanks very much. Really interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.